Hello and welcome to the Physiology of Endurance Running podcast. I'm Owain. I'm joined by Dan. How's it going, Dan?
Yeah, I'm good. Yeah, bit tired. Bit tired. I feel like I'm more tired now. I'm in the taper for Valencia versus when I was running 200k weeks. So there we go. The psychology has started. The mental strain of doing a bit less training and thinking that my goal race is 10 days away. Whatever we're on at now, it's starting to catch up with me. I think.
Yeah,
How are
yeah,
you
similar,
doing?
similar boat. Yeah, yeah. Maybe I don't think I'm feeling quite as bad as you, but
I'm
we'll.
not, but I'm not dying. I'm
No.
just, you know when I don't think I'm ill. I think I'm just tired, and I've not had enough sleep recently, which is
Yeah,
something I need to focus on. But when you're in the taper, you think you're ill every day, don't you? Well, I do anyway.
yeah.
Jemima laughs at me every time. She said, "Dan, you always say you're ill, and you're never ill. You're just a hypochondriac."
Yeah, this morning, apart from thinking I'm ill, this morning when I was cycling, well, I ran and it was icy, and then I was like, probably shouldn't cycle this way, should I? And then I still cycled that way, and then I was like, why am I cycling on ice? This isn't not a good, what is it, performance decision? Is
No, no. You
Yeah.
start over analyzing everything. I was the same. I nearly stacked it running this morning because it was icy. But anyway, yeah. What's exciting though is that we've recorded another non-Road to Valencia series. It's taken us a bit of time, but now we're catching up. And yeah, had Elliot on recently talking about the power of hot baths and hot baths actually potentially being an even greater tool for increasing your hemoglobin mass at altitude, given the potential downsides that you do get with altitude. To go check that one out if you haven't. It's a really good discussion coming up, talking about some very current research. And then today we were very lucky to be joined by Dr. Sam Shepherd, who's head of sports science at Precision Fuel and Hydration, which he's been in that role for 18 months. But previously was a reader in exercise metabolism and nutrition at Liverpool John Moores. So he did his undergraduate degree in sport and exercise science at Birmingham University, then went north up to Aberdeen to do a master's in human nutrition and metabolism, and then finished off with a PhD back at Birmingham looking at exercise metabolism. And as he discusses, he's really interested in just nutritional and exercise interventions that can influence metabolism, both during exercise and outside of exercise as well. And one of the key nutritional supplements he's looked at is New Zealand blackcurrants, which, as you'd have heard from the Road to Valencia series, we were gifted some supplements during this build, and we've been putting it through its paces. Well, we finally got an expert on to really tell us why we've been taking New Zealand blackcurrants, and he's had a great new paper which has just come out looking at the effects on fat oxidation rates and actually on muscle glycogen levels in a rested state before pre-exercise. So some super interesting stuff, and basically gives us a really nice rundown of um, what we do know and do not know about currants, and where the benefits may lie in taking it, and where actually we still are a bit unsure. As well as a dive into his role at Precision Fuel and Hydration and what he's doing with some of the elite athletes that company sponsors and supports. So yeah, really good chat. I really enjoyed.
Yeah. I definitely felt like I learned a bit more about the research and then the sort of use of blackcurrants. Um, no, I thought that was really good. I'd say as well the paper will be linked in the show notes if you want to have a read. Um, yeah, have a read yourself. Like we mentioned, but like the amount of work that it took to do that study is pretty mental. Like I know I was just asking people. I was just like, oh, yeah, just don't do any like intense exercise and don't have a bath the day before or the week before bath. Yeah, and then just show up at this time. But like the amount of work they did for this paper is pretty unbelievable as well.
It's the same with any nutritional intervention. I think you've got to control so much that it becomes a big job. And the fact that it was doing long duration training as well, a long, yeah, training intervention, well, and not a training intervention, a single exercise bout, that is, yeah, tough on the participants, tough on the researchers as well.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. Just before the interview, as always, we're sponsored by Saw. My Saw gear is getting a lot of use in this weather. All right, this weather, at point of recording, it's been cold. I think it's maybe meant to get wet now, but yeah, I've been relying on my merino base layer every day pretty much. Yeah, it did serve me well today during my session. I thought, I sometimes you think when you wear a base layer, oh, this is going to be risky. Like if you get too hot and then you sweat and then you then get cold, but the merino layer was like perfect. It was, yeah, really, really good this morning. And we've mentioned it on the Road to Valencia series, but there's the Soar Solstice happening. So if you complete 21 hours of running in the first 21 days of December, so that's the 1st to the 21st of December, you can get £60 in Soar credit to use on their website. We will have a link in the show notes as well to this, but all you need to do is enter your email and then just upload a screenshot of your Strava or your Garmin or your Coros to just prove that you've done the amount of hours. I thought about this the other day, and I did this a few years ago, actually. I got the credit. So yeah, definitely worth doing. If you're out and about running, sort of makes the last few weeks of the year sort of even more worthwhile, hopefully. So yeah, get yourself some money off with Soar.
Some extra motivation on those wet, cold nights to get out, do your 1 hour a day, and then get a nice little payday at the end of it. Something to justify going out in this horrible weather. Yeah. I mean, one more thing to mention before we go to Dr. Sam Shepherd and a recording interview with him is that if you are interested in finding out a bit more about CurraNZ, there's a link in the show notes where you can see the description and purchase some if you think you want to give it a go. But I think, we'll leave you with Dr. Sam Shepherd now. Enjoy the interview. We both did, and look forward to seeing you. I don't know. Looking forward to you coming to listen to our podcast again soon. We're very lucky today to be joined by Dr. Sam Shepherd, researcher and applied sports scientist with precision fuel and hydration. Sam, this evening, how are you doing? You've been busy recently.
I'm good, thanks. Yeah, it's been a lot of traveling recently, a lot of World Championship races attending and supporting athletes out, which is always exciting. Shouldn't really complain about the travel. It is tiring, but it's very rewarding and exciting as well. So yeah, it's all good.
Some good success with your athletes out there.
Yeah, we've had a pretty successful year, I would say. It was interesting. It's a good time to actually stop and reflect on the year, and as we have been doing as a team at Precision Fuel and Hydration. And we're pretty lucky this year. We've had the winner of Western States, we've had the winner at Kona in the Ironman World Championships there for the girls, and then a winner at the 70.3 World Championships as well, Yelageen. So it's been pretty successful when you take those three results in isolation. Of course, there's been many more, but yeah, looking back and seeing those three is quite pleasing.
Yeah, you can't get much better than that, can you?
No.
So we would love to talk to you a bit today about one of your recent papers that came out on New Zealand blackcurrants, but also more broadly about how New Zealand blackcurrants can affect metabolism, fat oxidation rates, and just physiology in general. But before we get into that, it'd be great just to hear a bit more about how you ended up in the role you are today, sort of just your backstory, really, like academically, and how did you find yourself researching New Zealand blackcurrants and working as lead sports scientist for precision fuel and hydration?
Yeah, it's been quite a journey, actually. I suppose it was, I did my PhD at the University of Birmingham. The focus there was really broadly on exercise metabolism, but I was particularly interested in high intensity interval training as a mechanism to improve markers of cardiometabolic health, quite honestly. We had an interest in particular in what the adaptations were that were occurring in the muscle in response to high intensity interval training, and how that compared to the adaptations that you would induce via more traditional endurance type exercise training. And so we were taking muscle samples from people's legs, nice and fun stuff, and then looking at that under a microscope. And I was particularly interested in the sort of fat that accumulates in muscle. And for some people, that's a positive thing. When we're an endurance athlete, that's a good thing because it's a fuel source. And if you're overweight, you're sedentary, maybe you're obese, then it can be linked to the development of type 2 diabetes, having excess fat accumulating in your muscle. And so we were interested in exploring that paradox, interested in exploring how different types of training, as I said, high intensity interval training and moderate intensity training would alter that in both healthy and more unhealthy populations, and how that would improve markers of cardiometabolic health. And so that was my, I suppose, introduction. And the reason I've kind of drawn on that is because taking the samples of muscle was I suppose, a common theme through a lot of my research that I then did at Liverpool John Moores University. So I went for my PhD and completing that to work at Liverpool John Moores University for 12 years in the end, looking across all manner of different areas. I don't like to say I'm a bit of a jack of all trades, but I spread myself quite wide there and got involved in a lot of different projects. But central to what I was always interested in was this idea of how is exercise and nutrition going to influence what's happening in the muscle, and what does that mean, from a health perspective, but also from a performance perspective. And I was a big believer in, if you can understand what's happening at that sort of molecular level, then you can understand how to, that extrapolates out to lead to improvements in performance or lead to improvements in health. And I think, if we bring then in the sort of New Zealand blackcurrant component to that, I think it was in, I want to say 2015, got an email from a chap at the University of Chichester, Mark Willems, so Professor Mark Willems, and he'd been investigating New Zealand blackcurrants for a few years at that point. And they ran a couple of studies. They'd shown in a couple of these studies that, just 7 days of supplementing with a couple of CurraNZ capsules per day could lead to improvements or increases in fat oxidation during exercise. And I thought, that's quite interesting. Obviously, I've got an interest in fat oxidation and how that's been driven, how that, impact of nutrition and exercise on that. And the issue that Mark had was, he was like, I don't know any girls who are interested in taking part in these studies. So we've done these studies in men. We don't have an issue with recruiting them. We need to look a little bit wider and spread the net a little bit wider to recruit some females to take part in these studies to see if those effects also occurred in the females. And I don't know why he contacted me specifically. I can't say it's because I know a lot of females at that point in time. But anyway, so we took on that study to try and investigate whether that also transpired in females. Did this blackcurrant extract actually improve fat oxidation? And we showed back in 2018 that it did. So that sort of set off this, I suppose, interest in this blackcurrant extract world. It was quite interesting because I presented this work at the American College of Sports Medicine conference earlier this year, actually, and I put up a slide initially, which was quite facetious, but it was actually probably true as well, because I was very skeptical when Mark first contacted me and discussed this study that he'd done, or a couple of studies. And I was very much like, I can't believe that there's such a supplement is going to have a profound effect on metabolism like this in such a short period of time. I couldn't quite understand. So I thought, well, this is quite a good project to do, to almost like disprove. And I think that's a good way, to go into these research things, right? You want to go in with a level of skepticism to say, well, actually, I'm not sure what the outcome is going to be here. But, well, as it transpired, it did also improve fat metabolism in the girls, which was quite surprising. So yeah, then we started that journey, interested in the New Zealand blackcurrants.
I guess maybe another way to start with the New Zealand blackcurrants is if you're just able to explain, I guess, what a polyphenol is, because that's something that comes up, straight away when you read this research, is polyphenols. Are you able to make, I don't know if it's possible to give a sort of lay explanation of polyphenols, but
Yeah,
if that's possible.
yeah, it's an interesting one. So, yeah, New Zealand blackcurrants are rich in what we call anthocyanins. Now, anthocyanins are a type of polyphenol, essentially, and anthocyanins being a kind of subcategory of polyphenols. They're the anthocyanins in particular are found in like colourful sort of plants, and it's the deep sort of purple colour that is the anthocyanin, essentially, that we see in blackcurrants as one example. Um, and through a series, through freeze drying and processing of that, then you can create an extract which is like a super strength of that anthocyanin, essentially.
Yeah, because I think I read somewhere that one tablet is worth like 83 blackcurrants or that sort of ballpark. So it's super. You have to eat a lot of blackcurrants to get the same level of anthocyanin, which is probably going to cause your stomach a bit of upset, regardless of everything else.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I think in the latest round it's hit 83 blackcurrants is equivalent to one capsule. And in the studies that we've done, it's been mainly 2 capsules per day for 7 days that we're giving to people to see these effects. So yeah, in the region of 160 blackcurrants, which everyone's welcome to try and eat on a regular basis. Maybe 1 or 2 days might be okay, but after that you might be struggling a little bit.
Yeah, I imagine. So it's really interesting to hear that you were initially skeptical, because I mean that was my first stance as well when I started hearing the claims to start with, and then actually doing a bit more of a deeper dive into the research. But actually, I think a lot of people just in general have this skepticism about any sort of nutritional supplement, in that there's so much false advertisement, misleading claims that probably can't be backed up by evidence. And so I think it's very healthy to approach the sort of study that you did, coming in with the idea that you don't think it's going to work. That's probably a healthy scientific approach, would you say, to answering anything? Not coming in with bias of trying to prove that something does work.
Yeah, and you always start with the null hypothesis, right? So the null hypothesis being that this isn't going to have an effect. And that's your start point, and you're trying to prove that that isn't the case, essentially, by doing that study. And it's been really interesting in terms of that journey, seeing more and more research in particular coming from Mark Williams's lab, but other labs around the world, and anecdotal evidence as well from athletes. It's all very well saying it has this effect, but it's also a lot of that's driven by what athletes how they're using it, and also what they're feeling. And often the anecdotal evidence is like, yes, it's difficult to prove that it's having an effect for those individuals, but they seem to get a benefit from it when they take it versus when they don't take it, across a number of different outcomes. And so that's often the start point, I think, for these types of studies anyway. It's like someone is doing something and we want to then understand why it might be of benefit from a scientific perspective, right?
Absolutely. So you've said that the anthocyanin is the active component within New Zealand blackcurrants. Do we know how that is influencing fat oxidation? What metabolic pathways it's affecting, or is that just still the unknown?
It's the $1 million question. And I suppose the study that we've most recently done has tried to lead us down a little path there to understand it, and we still don't fully understand it. So to be clear, we were initially, and Mark's work was initially interested in looking at whole body rates of fat oxidation. So in terms of measuring that, taking expired air to analyze the amount of oxygen and CO2 that is in the expired air, doing some nice calculations to understand whole body rates of carbohydrate and fat oxidation and how that's been changed with the blackcurrant extract supplementation. The mechanism for that we don't know. So one thing that we did in our 2018 study in females was we took serial blood samples pre-exercise and then through our exercise to try and measure free fatty acid, plasma fatty acid concentrations and glycerol concentrations. And glycerol is like a marker of fat breakdown, fat liberation from our fat stores in the body. And if in theory, if you're seeing an increase in glycerol and you will also see an increase in fatty acid levels in the blood, that's indicative of greater rates of fat breakdown occurring. And that was one of the things we did observe in that paper. So we saw an increase in whole body rates of fat oxidation, and what we thought was happening was actually that's being driven by greater breakdown of fat in our fat stores around the body before and during exercise. So mechanistically, that's kind of what we thought might be happening at that point. How that is being, or how the anthocyanins are impacting that at a molecular or a deeper level, we still don't really know at this point in time. So it's a bit of an open question that still requires investigation, to be honest.
But you seem to be seeing a consistent response, and you've had multiple studies in different populations seeing an increase in fat oxidation rates. What sort of magnitude are we talking about with in terms of like fat oxidation rates, and I guess then what is the knock-on effect on performance?
Well, the magnitude is an interesting one. I think this is where we have to just be very clear with people. So we're seeing an improvement of somewhere in the region of 20 to 30% increase in fat oxidation at a whole body level. And that's, across a range of populations. So healthy people all the way through to people who are a little bit metabolically challenged, let's say, overweight or obese sedentary individuals who are doing that exercise. Now, bear in mind, particularly at the sort of unhealthier end of that spectrum, those rates of whole body fat oxidation are going to be relatively low anyway. So a 20 to 30% increase isn't a huge jump in relative terms. That being said, we're also observing this in very healthy and even active people at this point, whose whole body rates of fat oxidation are naturally higher. They're fitter, therefore it's going to be higher. And we're still seeing that same sort of magnitude of an increase. So I think we saw a 27% increase on average in our first study, and then in our most recent study, I think it was sort of 24%, if I recall the numbers exactly. So it's quite a consistent finding. You're right. The $1 million question really is like, okay, well, we're improving fat metabolism, fat oxidation. Does that actually lead to a significant improvement in some performance outcome? And I'd argue at this point, we don't know if the two are interlinked or not. And probably the studies haven't been done to really understand whether there is a true performance benefit to that, quite honestly. And I'd love to be able to say, yes, there's a clear benefit here and a clear performance benefit. But that was one of the things that was kind of a secondary outcome in our most recent study that we wanted to address. So we can kind of go into that study, and what we asked people to do there was we did a typical supplementation approach here is just 7 days, 2 capsules of CurraNZ per day. And on the 7th day, they will come into the lab. We will do some exercise bout, and in this case, it was 2 hours of exercise on a cycloergometer, moderate intensity exercise. So a level of exercise that is where fat metabolism is going to play a key role. And then immediately after they'd done that exercise, we asked them to do like a performance test, which was riding for as long as they could at 150% of their lactate threshold. So it's a relatively short period, maybe 3 or 4 minutes, that most people will then continue to ride for. Now, whilst that's at some level of performance outcome, I don't think it's truly representative of what people are doing in the field. That's not going to, that's not a marathon that we're asking people to do, or a half marathon as a performance test, or even like a 10K or a 5K run, for example. The reason we took that approach was because we were interested in seeing whether the increase in fat oxidation that we expected to see with the CurraNZ would preserve muscle glycogen stores. And we know that muscle glycogen is going to be a key substrate during very short high intensity exercise, which is what that performance test was looking to measure, basically. Now, interestingly, what we saw was there wasn't really a sparing effect, despite there being higher rates of fat oxidation, which was interesting. And we didn't see significant performance benefits in that particular test. That being said, again, it's a small scale study because we were interested in mechanisms. So we only recruited 10 participants for this, but 9 out of the 10 actually improved their performance with CurraNZ. There was one that didn't, which then leads you to,
P equals 0.08, I saw.
That's right, yeah. So
isn't it? But
frustratingly, it kicks out a non-significant finding, but we can still look at that and say, well, 9 out of 10 people actually went a little bit better there with the CurraNZ, which was interesting.
I guess like we've just been talking about performance outcomes and like you said, like, does it improve your marathon time or for you your Ironman performance? But do you think it has any impact or potentially has any impact on just day-to-day training? Like if you're just slightly able to shift your sort of substrate utilization, could that have a benefit that maybe the CurraNZ isn't directly impacting on the day performance, but it allows some training benefit, on the build up to race day?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I guess it's one of those that we don't really know. Again, being honest, at this point in time, I'd love to tell you one way or the other whether that was true. Of course, those studies are incredibly difficult to do where you capture and control that type of information. But one of the, aside from the improvement in fat metabolism that we're seeing with CurraNZ, one of the things that we're people constantly talk about is this improved recovery that they feel when they're taking CurraNZ. So from a training perspective, if you're able to recover faster, feel better going into your next session and do that consecutively and improve the consistency in training, that's potentially, yes, where it's going to hold true that ultimately you can train better, you can train more, the quality's higher, you're going to, it ultimately improves your performance kind of indirectly. Again, don't know for sure, but that's based on quite a lot of anecdotal evidence. And I would say that's the one clear, subjective piece of feedback that we get from people is that actually I feel much better recovered when I'm using that supplement, which is interesting. But again, it's an area that we need to investigate fully.
I think one thing you did find in your recent paper was increased muscle glycogen storage in the group that had taken CurraNZ for the 7 days prior. Is that potentially a mechanism which, if you're helping increase muscle glycogen and maintain muscle glycogen stores within a training block, is that going to aid maintain performance and recovery? Because I always think that muscle glycogen before a competition, where it's going to be pretty maximized anyway from just reducing training load, but actually where you're really facing challenges to muscle glycogen are probably in that training block where you're doing high volumes of training, lots of intensity in there. I mean, especially when you're talking about marathon runners or triathletes in general.
Yeah, totally right. And being honest, that outcome from the study was completely by surprise and accidental. So the design of the study and a lot of these metabolic studies that we want to do where we're investigating substrate utilization, whether that's carbohydrate and or fat oxidation at either a muscle level or a whole body level, we always want to try and go into the sort of experimental trial with consistent muscle glycogen stores when we're comparing conditions. So in this case, a placebo versus the CurraNZ supplement. And so we'd gone to great lengths, quite honestly, to try and control the pre-exercise levels of muscle glycogen. So one way that we would normally do this, and in other studies we've done, is participants would come in a couple of days before the main experimental trial. They would do a glycogen depleting bout of exercise, and then you refeed with a set amount of carbohydrate. And that's a very clean way, or it should be a very clean way, that you achieve very similar levels of muscle glycogen across the different experimental trials and interventions that you're going to do. And so we followed that route that we'd always done. And it kind of turned out yeah, almost by accident that we found something quite cool, and it wasn't the main aim of the study when we set out to do this, but it was probably one of the primary observations and most important observations that came from the study, which was fantastic. Because what we saw is our participants came, they did their depletion, we re-fed carbohydrate for sort of 36 hours at a fairly high rate, 8 grams per kilo over that period. And then we took a muscle sample before they started their experimental trial, which was, as I said, 2 hours of moderate intensity cycling on a bike, and looked at muscle glycogen levels in that pre-exercise muscle sample. And they were much higher in people who'd supplemented with the CurraNZ versus when they'd done the same thing but used the placebo. So it was a complete surprise for us to find that, but it was a pretty cool observation. And so the application of that is, as exactly as you said there, Dan, is that it should mean that people can recover more efficiently from the exercise that they've done if they feed, relatively adequate carbohydrate, but you should sort of enhance the ability to store that in the muscle. And that's then going to have an impact on the subsequent session, training session that you're then able to undertake. Ideally, you're going to have a higher level of muscle glycogen going into that session, which if that session's a harder, high intensity type session, a track session, then has clear benefits to performance in that session.
Yeah, my first thought reading the paper was like just the amount of work you had to do, like even before the sort of, the main experiment as such started. Like just I was reading through and I was like, this just keeps going before you've even like, got to it. And then, fair play for the participants as well. Like, being happy to do it. Forget like the biopsies as well. Just I think the glycogen depletion bout sounded like the worst part.
Yeah, they're pretty horrendous, quite honestly, because it is as it sounds. You are just going to depletion. It is exercise to failure, and sometimes that can be quite short, and then more often than not, it's quite a long period of time where people are exercising for. But yeah, we've shown across a number of different studies that it's very good normally at controlling muscle glycogen stores for the experimental bout that we're interested in. But yeah, I was pleased that we went to those lengths because we definitely discussed, other approaches like where you would just feed a set amount of carbohydrate without the depletion bout beforehand over 24 hours. And again, that's relatively good at standardizing muscle glycogen stores. But this was definitely a much cleaner and more, reliable approach to that. So I was pleased that we took that approach in the end because I don't know if we would have necessarily found what we did find if we hadn't.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly leads credibility to your finding, but it's a true finding and not just one of these things that pops up every now and again by chance when you've got a sample size of 10. One of the papers I didn't read, but I saw that I skimmed was that CurraNZ can improve insulin sensitivity in certain populations. Would that be a mechanism through which it would help with the what am I trying to say, loading muscle glycogen?
Potentially. Now, of course, the people that we did this study in were relatively healthy. So, and what I mean by that is they were probably relatively insulin sensitive. But the study that you're alluding to that we previously did, that was in a overweight sedentary population who were a little bit more metabolically challenged and their insulin sensitivity was lower. I think under these circumstances, we were interested in understanding that, well, the likelihood is there's some mechanism which we don't yet know that may improve glucose uptake into the muscle. Potentially that is the mechanism that is driving that greater glycogen storage under these circumstances. We've also, and not yet published, but hopefully in the next few months will do, we've done a short or a more acute study where, again, our participants were fantastic and did a depletion protocol. We then rather nastily provided very low carbohydrate diet. They came in the day after having slept low, let's say, low muscle glycogen. They did a little bit more exercise, really just to finish them off. They had very low levels of muscle glycogen at that point. And then we looked over a 4-hour period at the rate of glycogen resynthesis. And again, with the CurraNZ, that was slightly higher than it was with the placebo. So 2 studies that we've now done are pointing to that same situation occurring, where there's greater glycogen storage with currans over slightly different time periods, but that's fine over a short and a longer term period. But again, it leads back to the application being that if you've got a short period of time between training sessions, make sure you get some carbohydrate in. And if you've been using currans, the likelihood is that there's going to be some level of greater storage of that glycogen. So you should be then slightly better prepared for that second session in the day. It's I guess the classic, if we look at the Norwegian stuff where you're trying to do double threshold or something like that, maybe there's an opportunity to go into that second session of the day slightly more glycogen loaded, let's say, if you've been using currants.
Is there any thought around, I guess, like periodization of currants or New Zealand blackcurrants, and either periodization of using it or not using it, or in terms of like a loading protocol? Are there any thoughts around that yet?
Yeah, good question. I would defer to the research and say pretty much everything that has been done so far has been over a short period of time. So a 7-day period with 2 capsules per day, essentially, as a standard like loading period. What we don't know yet is how that transpires the longer you take it, and should that be something that you're doing, throughout the season, or should you do it in small periods where maybe training intensity is higher? That would be the reasonable sort of suggestion in my mind, that through those more intense periods of training is when you would use currants, and then when it's out of season or it's a recovery week, perhaps you don't need to use it quite the same at that point. But I'm purely speculating, really. The research definitely needs to be done on that.
Anecdotally, then, the athletes that you've seen experience it and take it and report positive effects on recovery, performance, whatever, how are they tending to implement it? Is it a just take it all year round, or is there a bit more of a periodization to it?
There seems to be a bit of a mix, to be honest. Yeah, some people will use it periodically around those like higher training volume periods. Some people will use it all year round. We do see some people doing like stage races, for example. They will use it throughout to ensure that they're recovering from each day's racing. So a variety of different ways, quite honestly.
And then in terms of you already said already, we haven't really got a clear-cut case for it's directly improving performance in an acute setting. But if it is improving muscle glycogen storage, where do you think it would potentially have the biggest implication for performance, and where may it not? Where may currants not actually have much of an effect?
I mean, yeah. So if it's improving that capacity to store muscle glycogen, then the obvious sort of translation of that is to any sort of exercise that is reliant on muscle glycogen as the primary fuel source. And for most people, you can certainly say a 5 or a 10K, half marathon for the faster guys, even up to a marathon, I would say, to ensure that they're starting like fully like loaded from a glycogen perspective. I see the biggest benefit being day-to-day training, though, where we've kind of talked about already that capacity to replenish muscle glycogen stores is somewhat challenged sometimes, primarily through time availability in between sessions. And so that's most likely where I would say the benefit is going to come.
I guess one of the things we haven't touched on, which is super important, is are there any adverse effects that you might experience from taking currants?
It's a good question. I've not experienced anyone yet suffering with adverse effects. It's always an interesting question, because whenever we do these studies, our ethics board is always asking, what are the likely side effects of taking a blackcurrant extract? And I'm left scratching my head quite often as to what that might be and what I need to tell participants to be aware of. So at the moment, I can't I can't say for sure there's any side effects. Even
I think you'd have probably heard about them by now, wouldn't you? If there were, I mean, there's like obvious comparisons with, we know that taking too much caffeine can affect performance, and more recently, like the bicarb craze, that can all go wrong quite quickly if you take too much. So it's not like it's you've got to weigh up those pros versus cons, which that doesn't seem to be the case because I've been taking it this marathon block into Valencia, and again, not had any side effects. Whereas I know that bicarb doesn't agree with me in whatever form you package it in.
Interesting.
With the studies you've done on New Zealand blackcurrants, were there any like non-responders in the groups, or was it fairly sort of uniform response rate?
Yeah, I mean, we talked about the performance outcome for the latest study, and there was one person who didn't respond. I know Mark has done a lot more work. He's had a lot more participants through a range of his studies where he started to look at some of these individual responses. So one particular outcome, I suppose, there related to fat metabolism. He published a study a couple of years ago now that showed this sort of relationship between those individuals with the highest, or sorry, should I say lowest rates of fat oxidation will benefit the most from the CurraNZ supplementation. So it kind of makes sense, right? You've got more room to improve, and so if you do something, and that includes exercise, but also using a supplement, then there's more room to see an improvement versus those individuals with very high rates of fat oxidation already. So I think you could probably say, if you took a group of people who are following a low carb, high fat diet, they may well not observe an improvement in fat metabolism because their rates of fat oxidation will already be very high via dietary means.
We've talked loads about fat oxidation, and that's super interesting. Is there any other mechanisms where CurraNZ might help performance or training? Any other reported benefits, I guess, of taking CurraNZ?
Yeah, and I guess one of the mechanisms that we initially thought of and had been reported was an improvement in blood flow, and we think that might be occurring via effects on like the vasodilator mechanism in blood vessels. The outcome of that being that we can then deliver oxygen much more efficiently, nutrients, glucose, fats to the muscle for oxidation more efficiently. Again, I think those studies need to be done to really show that mechanism and CurraNZ can influence that mechanism. We are starting to do some cellular studies. So there's a PhD student who led this study, Lawrence Jones, that's already been published. He's doing some cell work now to start to try and unpick some of those mechanisms at a cellular level, because then we can start to think about, okay, if we look at these various mechanisms in cell models and identify one or two mechanisms, we can then move that to a human study and try and show that also is the case, like in vivo, let's say.
I guess if it's increasing vasodilation, then that would be working in a similar means to beetroot, sort of delivering a similar effect, I guess, but maybe with slightly less of a side effect of not turning your pee red.
Yeah, quite possibly. And I mean, this is always the I guess the thing that's brought up as well is like, yes, that might be one mechanism by which it is having an effect, but we're also seeing these other mechanisms potentially as well, which is interesting. So it's like multifaceted, and I think it's interesting. The guys at CurraNZ are very supportive of research, and they just want to understand how it's working essentially, and under what circumstances that is going to work. They've shown in some there was a study a few years ago now showing that it improved like climbing performance leading into the Tokyo Olympics. So in a group of athletes there, which is super interesting and very relevant for that group. but I would say for people out there, if they're interested in and they have interesting questions that they might want to answer and have thoughts on what the mechanisms might be, then definitely reach out to the guys at CurraNZ, because they're very open to conversations about furthering their understanding of how it works.
Yeah, there's a lot of published research, to be fair, which is actually, as I said at the start, normally quite lacking in terms of supplements and nutritional supplements. Where do you think currants or New Zealand blackcurrants more generally sits into the whole landscape of supplements in terms of, I guess, the ones where we've got good evidence for is going to affect performance or recovery, and ones we're probably a bit more skeptical on?
Yeah, great question. It's probably getting there is a very broad statement, but an optimistic statement probably from me as well to some extent. I think there's pretty good evidence now, and like you've touched upon, there's a bulk of evidence that's pointing towards these metabolic benefits. The thing that's probably lacking a little bit is the performance benefits being very clear, and also across a range of performance outcomes. And I think that's most likely where the research needs to move to really establish itself as yes, this is a supplement that can improve your performance under these specific circumstances. That's really where it's going to make a difference. When we think about supplements that do improve performance, caffeine is a great example. It's very clear where caffeine is going to have a benefit for people. And that's, ultimately, to put it on level par with caffeine, that's where it needs to head from a research perspective. Of course, we've been researching caffeine for many, many years, and this is relatively new as well. So it's going to take a bit of time to get there. But the more people use it, the more people have an interest in it, and the more people are prepared to investigate it, then it will ultimately get to that point, one way or another, as to whether it is a supplement that we can, really rely on to generate an improvement, whether that's a 1 or 2% improvement or not.
As someone that's heavily involved in sort of the supplement research world, is there a good sort of a good quick test someone can do if they see a supplement and they want to know, does this actually work, like sort of beyond any marketing? Is there sort of like telltale signs that this supplement's well researched, or there might be an evidence base that maybe aren't quite as in depth as like looking on PubMed and like going into a meta-analysis sort of thing? Is there any like good signs for a supplement that you see and think might be worth looking at?
I would say openness from the company that are talking about that supplement, about the research that there's been done, quite honestly. You'll know yourselves, you see this on social media a lot. Instagram is the worst for it, that these supplements pop up, and I've definitely, challenged certain companies on a supplement. Ask the question essentially, like, can you show me the research that shows the benefit that you're trying to tell me exists from this supplement? And people have got to be critical of that and always ask those questions. And then when you get that research, you really got to dig into it yourself a little bit as well to fully understand it. I wouldn't use, influencers and athletes using that supplement as the primary reason that you should start using it, because most likely there's some financial reward involved for them. And so there's no, I suppose the answer is there's not really a quick way to understand that other than digging into the research. And I won't name the company, but I've previously asked one company about a supplement that they were selling, asked them to provide the research, and they sent me a blog, and then they sent me an abstract to a paper. I read the abstract and I was like, well, that doesn't add up with what they're saying. I then found the full text, and the abstract didn't even match what was written in the full text. And I couldn't quite believe that they'd made this supplement, was selling this supplement based on not reading a paper properly, essentially. It seemed crazy to me. So it doesn't take that long to dig into it, really. I think more companies are becoming aware of that now and recognizing that they need some research and good research to support the claims that they're making. And so that's ultimately what people need to be looking for.
I think I've seen it's maybe not it's not happened in the endurance sport world as maybe to the same degree, but with like pre-workout supplements and people sort of digging through the ingredients list, because that's multiple ingredients in that, and sort of saying, well, this isn't dosed nearly enough, and then this doesn't work well with this, or they're doing the same thing, and yeah, like the depth that you sort of have to go to, and with with those supplements, it's like celebrities and social media sort of influencers make their own supplement, and then it's not dosed and it doesn't work well together. And I just think like I really hope endurance sports doesn't go that way, where you've got these like mixes of supplements and are being sold, and then you have to figure out is that even any good, sort of thing.
Yeah, and that's the thing that is often not established in the research, is these interaction effects. When you're talking about a supplement that has multiple like ingredients, like you say, they might be counteracting each other. It's very rare, or there's very few research studies that look at caffeine and or currants in together to see if they do work together. And as just as one very easy example. So you're completely right. Yeah, these and I think that's the obvious way that the supplement world will move to, is like going, well, this works, this works, this works. Well, let's just throw them all together and we'll get a compound benefit, right? And that's clearly not going to be the case.
Yeah, it's all these marginal gains. The idea they all add up when they probably don't.
No.
1% from caffeine, 1% from bicarb, 1% from currants. Oh, you're not going to be 3% better, most likely.
No, totally.
Sam, we've heard so much about your research hat on, but obviously you're working as an applied sports scientist as well. Could you talk us through what a typical day looks like as for you in your day job, if there is such a thing as a typical day?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. There's definitely not a typical day. I guess a lot of what we're doing at Precision Fuel and Hydration now is working with a lot of our sponsored athletes, as they're leading into events, trying to really support them from a science perspective, pulling together their nutrition plans primarily. But we spend a lot of time reflecting on those afterwards as well, feeding back to athletes and looking at what we can do to improve and iterate those plans as well. It's fantastic because we're interested in endurance sport primarily, but we're working with middle distance triathletes, long distance triathletes, more and more ultra runners. So I kind of mentioned we were out at Western States earlier this year, which is a great race to be involved in, and we're crewing the athletes that we're supporting there. So you get real, on the ground feedback and as to how they're tolerating the race, what they're doing. And I think under those circumstances, it's really interesting because you can make some suggestions and have a real impact on their race. Yeah, triathlon is great as well, but an athlete is largely on their own under those circumstances. You just hope that the plan kind of comes together. So that's primarily what we're doing, but we're also we've got our own lab now down at Precision Fuel and Hydration HQ. We're on the South Coast. We're doing a lot of work looking at the effects of heat acclimation on performance, on how that influences sweat sodium losses. And I would say the research kind of arm, if you like, it was probably one of the reasons that I was brought into the business 18 months ago, to try and move that forward and answer some questions internally that are going to improve the support that we can provide to our athletes, but also to our customer base as well.
I guess you're working at sort of the I don't know, tip of the spear of athletes, but is there sort of any sort of common like misconceptions that you sort of see with the athletes you're working with, or maybe with the sort of wider base of athletes that Precision work with isn't the right word. Get people buy products from, or is there like sort of any big misconceptions you see quite a lot?
There's certainly a lack of understanding around sodium requirements and how the constant conversation we're having with people is to understand what their losses are in terms of sodium relative to their sweat losses, so their sweat rate, and then replacing accordingly. So we often talk to athletes about taking sodium in milligrams per litre as a concentration, because the natural thing is to defer back and go, well, what does that mean in milligrams per hour? And you go, okay, we can work that out, but they're kind of two separate things that we're trying to consider here. So that's probably one of them. The thing that we're seeing more and more now, of course, is that these super high rates of carbs that people are doing during racing, during training. Is that for everyone? Is it necessary for everyone to do that? That's primarily where we're having a lot of conversations at the moment, and which one of the fundamentals at Precision is we're always trying to educate, whether that's our customers or the athletes that we're supporting from a sponsorship perspective. And I would say there's you can look on our website the case studies that we write about the results and the races that these athletes do, and you can certainly see that the grams per hour has crept up and up over the years. It'll be interesting to see if that continues. We certainly see anecdotally like some people doing crazy numbers, and we sometimes can't get our head around it. But it's an interesting one because more often than not, as we kind of talked about already, an athlete's doing something and then you start to work out why they're doing it because it seems to have some benefit for them, right? And so that's, I think primarily where we're spending a lot of our time is educating people and going, well, how much carbohydrate do you actually need and what does that mean for you? And again, it's an individualization and a personalization thing.
Yeah, it's crazy. Some of the numbers for you here. I don't know if you saw this, but Joe Klecker, who was in the New York Marathon, apparently took on 175 grams of carbohydrates per hour. And he had a good debut, but you can't just infer from that was the right thing to do for him. I would definitely wouldn't be coping with 175 grams of carbohydrates an hour. I've played around with 120 and had okay results in terms of I can tolerate it, but am I actually absorbing that? And is it eating performance? Are you doing any of these assessments of absorption rates and looking at actual energy expenditures at the intensities they're going to be racing at?
We're starting to think about that a lot more. So we can't do those measurements directly in our lab, but we do have collaborators at the University of Birmingham who we're doing a little bit of work with there. Gareth Wallace, who I've known since my time doing my PhD in Birmingham. So we've done some work with him, with a couple of our athletes to understand what that is on an individual level and do we need to iterate the plan accordingly. And that's where it's heading. I would say that there needs to be some critique of how you actually measure those things though as well. And you need a reliable test to be able to do that. That's the key thing. Going back to Joe Klecker very quickly, that the more impressive thing there was that he was doing that, ultimately 5 fluid, right? It was like 2.8 litres of fluid that he consumed in 2 hours. Was it 2 hours 10 that he ran?
Yeah. And it wasn't a hot day.
No. So he's close to like just over 1.3 litres an hour, which is pretty impressive running at those speeds for sure.
I definitely thought when I heard him talk about the plan before on the podcast he was on before, like I thought that's a ridiculous amount to drink. Like that the carb rate obviously stood out, but like I couldn't believe he was going to drink that much.
Whether it's true or not, I can imagine there was some fluid left in those bottles, and that's the one thing that we're trying to do at Precision. We go to a lot of these events. Western States is the primary example of that, where we're crewing the athletes and we're literally weighing everything and every bottle that they have, every gel that they have, to see how much is like left and actually how much they do have. And there's always a bit of a discrepancy. They say they've had a gel. Okay, they've had most of a gel, but there's a few grams of carbohydrate left in there, and that compounds, certainly over 10, 14 hours that people are racing for during that event. So that when I see these high numbers being touted, I'm also aware that it's probably a little bit lower than that in reality. Yeah.
I mean, with the Joe Klecker thing as well, you think you'd be heavier at the end when you were at the start if you were taking on that amount of liquid, which probably isn't advantageous in itself. Where do you think it will end up? Do you think we're going to find a sweet spot of carbohydrate intake, or is it going to just become even more personalized? So I think everything is obviously shifting upwards, but there's obviously an upper limit to that, and I think 175 grams is probably pretty close to that. Where do you think we're going to end up?
It's an interesting one because, we've seen in the last couple of weeks a study published by my colleagues or previous colleagues at Liverpool John Moores University showing that 120 grams an hour improves run economy. So the oxygen cost of the exercise. No one has yet done 150 grams or 180 grams. So, and people are, like Joe Klecker, are suggesting that is what they're doing. So ultimately, in time, that's going to have to be tested to see if there's an even greater benefit to run economy, taking that level of carbohydrate. So we're probably not at the precipice of like that leveling off just yet. I think it's going to continue to rise. It will plateau, I would imagine, at some point. And then we'll probably go back the other way because everything works in cycles, right? So maybe in 15 years' time we're back to 90. But let's wait and see.
One thing you prompted me off there was one of the advantages of taking on a high carbohydrate intake during the race is, but if you're burning more carbohydrates, you tend to be more economical, more efficient, reduce your oxygen cost. Would CurraNZ then, if you're increasing your fat oxidation rates, reduce your economy if you're relying more on that energy source?
It's a great question. That's a question that someone needs to answer for sure. Who knows? Like you've just put it out there. That's a potential mechanism that needs to be investigated. Essentially, we really don't know at this point in time.
No, that's still lots to look at by the sounds of it. But
any aspiring PhD students, there you go. That's a thesis title there for you.
I just had one more sort of applied question. With some of the athletes you're working with, when they're, if the days before Western States or before, Ironman World Champs or 70.3 World Champs, when they've got their carb plan, do they look at it and think this is going to be tough? Because just from anecdotal experience, and I don't know if Dan's the same. I think you do slightly less carbs per hour than me, Dan. But I'm thinking about Valencia next week, and I'm thinking I don't think I'm going to necessarily enjoy, especially towards the end, the carbs and the gels. Like it's slightly pushing, and I wonder is that how the athletes you've worked with felt, or is actually that a guide maybe that I'm having too much?
I'd argue that might be a guide you're having too much. I've certainly never had a conversation with an athlete where they've gone, this is too much. Of course, we've worked up to the point at which we're at there. And we've talked a lot with those athletes about training the gut, making sure that you can tolerate this. I think for most, particularly during those longer events, they just accept that is part of it and it's a means to an end. Like, if I want to run at this speed, I've got to keep fueling and I'll find a way to do that. So it's a bit of mind over matter to some extent there as well. But there's also in the back of their minds that I can tolerate this. I have practiced this. So yeah, their trepidation, let's say, is less maybe than yours, Owen.
Yeah. I mean, I would say you're right. Like that is, in the same vein as I know, like at 23 miles, I'll be like, this is really tough. Like just running this pace, and that's the same approach. But yeah, I just wondered if that might be a sort of good, for the the person that doesn't have access to the lab, Like if they're trying to figure out, okay, how much can I tolerate? Like is having a tiny little bit of like, oh, I'm not going to be looking forward to that last gel. Maybe that's the right ballpark sort of guide. But yeah, obviously it's super individualized, and some people may love gels, some people can't do one gel. So yeah, there is that going on as well.
Yeah, and most people will just find out what works for them. And also, what we see, and it primarily stems from triathlon, is people going very high on the bike to give themselves an opportunity to probably go a little bit lower on the run if they need it. They might aim to do, 110 on the bike and then 90 on the run, and it might actually fall out as 70 on the run because that's how they felt on the day. But they're giving themselves the opportunity by going higher on the bike to do that. We probably haven't seen how that then filters down into marathon running yet. We probably see a similar thing in the longer trail races where the intake is relatively high at the start and it probably falls away a little bit, but equally, running speed will also fall away a little bit. And so it kind of matches that metabolic requirement to some extent as well.
When you're working with your athletes going into a 70.3 or whatever event it is, how much emphasis do you put on the carb load versus within race fueling? Do you think is an even split in terms of priority, or obviously you want to get everything spot on, but where do you see the biggest nutritional intervention to have a capacity to improve performance?
That's a really interesting question because anecdotally, from what I see, when you ask an athlete what they do as a carb load, it typically goes, well, I have a bit more chicken and rice the day before, all the way down to like, I just have, a big meal the night before. And that's probably one of the first things that I try to address is like, actually, this needs to be more structured and needs to be more thought, because simply having a little bit more rice through the day is not going to get you to the number that you want to be at. If we're aiming at 10 grams per kilo or 12 grams per kilo, that needs a concerted effort and a plan, especially, 24 hours before the race, where especially in triathlon, you're having to go and rack your bike. There's other, logistical issues to consider, which take away time from where you need to be eating. So you need to plan around this and be very structured in your approach. So most of the time, yes, we will focus on what people are doing during a race, and that's naturally what an athlete wants to talk about. But you really need to then strip it back and go, well, what are you doing in the days beforehand? Because that's also going to have a benefit or an impact on the performance and how you're starting that race. So, and most of the time, athletes, in my experience, have kind of found something that works, but it's more on feel. And when you really dive into it, it's not sufficient. And so there's clear opportunities there most of the time to have an impact in terms of carb loading more effectively, as well as them, how the race nutrition pans out as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it sort of fell out of favor, the carb load, a bit, is my perception. Obviously, I think people have been carb loading, and there was a whole depletion going into a carb load. I think people would do, in running at least, there are stories of people doing a fasted 20-mile run on the Sunday, then just going low carb for 3 or 4 days, and then going really heavy on the carbs prior. And then I think people realize that's probably a bit of a stupid idea, and then just forgot about carb loading in general. But it's definitely something I've made a more conscious effort with my own training and with the athletes that I support, probably just over the last year or two, to be honest, as I've grown more aware of the importance it can have. Because you're right, people just want to talk about the race nutrition.
And it's that extra few percent that we're always looking for, right? You look at every opportunity to improve performance, and it's a few percent probably. Most people aren't going into a race depleted. They'll have some level of muscle glycogen there, but it can certainly be improved in most. And it's always interesting because, these are athletes that are top of the game often. And you go, well, there's still little wins to be had here. And I would say, yeah, carb loading effectively is one of those that we would immediately look at.
I think for me, that's about it. Any last questions from you, Owain?
Nothing more from me. No, it's been really good. I feel like I've learned a lot tonight. So yeah,
Yeah, no, definitely. Really appreciate your time, Sam. So thank you very much for giving up your evening. And yeah, we'll share this with our listeners. I'm sure they'll be enjoy it.
No problem. Thanks very much for having me. Appreciate the opportunity to talk about the paper and what we're doing at Precision Fuel and Hydration now as well.
thanks, Sam.